This is the 7th presentation in Hermetic America Future. And one of the salient points that needs to be reestablished from time to time is that we are used to a stylized language that increasingly has become not just like sound bites or text messaging or the quality of repartee and cultural toned exchanges that are popular, slogans, advertising, cues. The ancient Hermetic wisdom, going all the way back more than 5,000 years, was that language was a very special vehicle. In fact, it was the energy carrier of the quality that we have as character. That he or she who experiences is a character in motion on the river of experience, and that all feelings, all images come in the undulations of the flow of experience and are indexed by language. So that when feeling tones and physical actions, the rituals that we do, the actual physical qualities of our movement as a base, floating the images, floating the feelings, language indexing that is the way in which all of this brought through the neural system into the brain. The brain shapes itself according to the indexing factor. Language posits in its ordering so that it is a symbolic order. The symbolic order of the mind is a language carried architecture. We know now from brain studies that there are different areas of the brain for different languages. Japanese language centers are lower down than English language centers, and so forth. The stylization of the earliest presentations of a wisdom language always had the qualities of hieroglyphic. That is, they were never simply pictorial of images, but had within them the indexing quality of language, meaning that hieroglyphics were not just meant to be looked at, but they were meant to be sounded out. They were meant to be spoken, so that the stylization of an oral language was extremely important. And in the tradition over more than 5,000 years, there has emerged a watershed of difference about styles of language that we're paying attention here in these presentations. The watershed is the difference between a rhetoric and a poetic. A poetic will have a hieroglyphic quality that when it is said, or when it is interiorly said by silently being read, the reading or the speaking will carry within that poetic a hieroglyphic quality of taking feelings and images and actions as their ritual base and bringing them into a symbolic structure that has to do further than just integrate rhetorically what a meaning is in terms of referentiality in terms of rhetorical logic, it will also have to have a double quality of being able to be forward referential. It has to have the ability to see forward, which means then that the referentiality cannot be on the basis of identity, but on the basis of a symmetry. One part of the symmetry is a polarity that allows for the logic of identification and for the mental focus of identity. This is the ego. But the other half of that symmetry is not a polarity, but a complementarity. And in the complementarity, it isn't the identity making the identifications on the basis of a rhetorical referentiality that is the most important, because it becomes malleable. It becomes capable of receiving transforms from the poetic side, from the complementarity side of language. What occurs here then is the art of speaking poetically, the art of writing, and one has now not just documents but literature. One has art instead of the referential identified style between symbol and referent ritual existential objects. The most important of the qualities that was passed on came to a culmination at the time of the Roman Empire being established by Augustus Caesar. And in that establishment, all poetic language was commandeered by the founders of the Roman Empire, commissioned under Augustus Caesar. And two of the strongest figures in that stylization, in that freezing of an empire mind, were Virgil and Horace. Virgil writing the Aeneid as the great founding epic for the Roman Empire, taking the Homeric epics from 1,000 years before and re-stylizing them, so that instead of having a Greek language mind as the synthesizing symbolic structure, one now had the golden age of Latin as the synthesizing structure, so that literally the brains, the neural systems, were rewired, as one would say in a colloquial way. Horace was the one who took the ability to go into the deeper qualities of inculcation, which were that one can not only receive an epic basis of an empire understanding, but that there are ways then to regard one's person in terms of that structure. And so Horace's odes, his epodes, are a further exercise in the establishment of how a language stylizes the brain, and thus the symbolic structure of thought, which is then the mind, conditions the referentiality so that the rituals are carried out because they are the only ones that are right in terms of the identifications and the identity focused in that symbolic mind. If you change to a different style of language, not just the side of the rhetoric, but include the poetic now, the poetic introduces a transforming quality. And this is where you find the difference between the language of someone who would speak like a Virgil in Augustus Caesar's time, and someone who would speak like Jesus. If one looks at the stylization of Virgil, it's one of the all-time classic great stylizations. It makes the Roman mind, which is able to bring the republic mind of Rome into an empire mind where all peoples are able to be absorbed into an expanded republic, now called not the empire, the original word was in Latin, the principate. It means the first of all, so that the world can join the Roman Empire, the Roman Principate, and the basis upon which one joins is you become a citizen of Rome, or you become a vassal under someone who is a citizen of Rome. And this kind of mind then lasts as long as the time form lasts. And the time forms of language styles have definite time limitations, and this is why the ancient Hermetic tradition is so powerful, because it came out, and the competition to Rome was the city of Alexandria, of equal size, of equal wealth, but it was a Greek language focus based upon a long 500-year, 600-year transformation of the Greek language in terms of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic quality. So that when one looks to find in Homer what is Homer writing about in the Iliad and the Odyssey, but there is a competition of power struggles, and Egypt is very much a part of this. And in fact, the returning Trojan victors, the Greeks, coming back home, almost none of them made it. Only a few were able to survive the homecoming. It is this quality that makes Alexandria, in the time of the 1st century AD, the focus of the poetic balance to the Roman Empire rhetoric, and the focus of the transforming poetic is in the prismatic person of Jesus. And so the mystery around Jesus is co-opted if you go into the Roman Empire absorption of what Jesus said and what he did. And the heritage that he left was never called Christianity. It was always called the way. The person who first called it Christianity was Paul, who always claimed right to the end of being a Roman citizen. In fact, he was taken to Rome under his own pleading that he not be handed over to the Jews. He wasn't ultimately Jewish. That he not be dealt with as some kind of a sect leader of Christianity, working out of Antioch and working as a proselytizer in the province of Asia, Asia Minor, but that he was a Roman citizen and could only be tried in Rome by Roman citizen peers. Christianity became a structure which then was, yes, reviled by persecutions in the Roman Empire, but eventually became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and it now became the Holy Roman Empire and has lasted until our time. The other side of this, in Alexandria, late, was the development of the Hermetica, which were deeper distillations of the Plato-Pythagorean tradition that by that time was almost 500, going on 600 years old, And it was that particular poetic of the Hermetic, Greek, Egyptian hieroglyphic way that was rediscovered in part in the Renaissance. And so the Renaissance began to withdraw itself from thinking that they were trying to inherit the Roman grandeur, the Roman splendor. Instead, we will have our own splendor. We will have a Florence that outdoes Rome. We will have a Venice that is much more adventurous and capacious than any of the Roman cities, the empire cities, could have been. And this spread into Europe so that you began to have, in the northern stretches of Europe especially, the establishment of the qualities of cities that now were going to outdo Rome. You began to have a Paris. You began to have a London. You began to have German cities like Heidelberg and eventually Berlin. You began to have cities like Amsterdam and so forth. And it began to be a quality then that we are no longer in that empire. We're no longer in that kind of language. And so you find in the Renaissance the development, especially in the early days and in the closing days, both, like a symmetry, you find the development of European vernacular languages that have a new poetic. In Italian, you have a Dante who uses Virgil as his guide for the first two-thirds of the Divine Comedy, and then shifts because Virgil can no longer take him further, cannot take him into Paradiso. And as soon as you find the quality of Dante's Italian language, you begin to have a different quality to the mind and a direct competitor to Horace. Dante is a direct competitor to Virgil. The direct competitor to Horace is a Petrarch who begins to write love sonnets to his beautiful visionary love, Laura. And the sonnets of Petrarch open up a quality of humanity that we have a different quality of person from persons before. Those Roman Empire persons were not classical persons. They were medieval persons. The classical era came to a close by persons who were prismatic and used a high poetic quality of language, not those that depended upon memorizing a rhetorical symbolic structure and then looking for the matching identifications, and that was their life. So the qualities that are being used here are the qualities of bringing a 21st century poetic into play. It is very difficult for someone who is inculcated in the cultural snippets of identifying language to hear the way that I talk. It not only passes over them, it passes through them as if it were invisible. They do not hear anything. It is characteristic of those who have never been exposed to a high poetic. That kind of exposure takes time to give the different language a chance to literally change the way in which the symbolic structure of thought is no longer limited, no longer stylized, to change the wiring of the brain, which actually happens, to grow new neuronal nets that were not there before, so that the aha moment comes when there are enough new neural nets to give you that aha recognition, which is different from understanding because you have heard something said right according to identifications. In poetry, it is something for the expansive differential of possibilities that now open up that were not only were they not thought of before, they could not have been thought of before. They were not there to discover before. And one of the greatest figures of all time, who literally learned because he did what ancient writing first did. He not only did it by hand, with the writing hand, but he held it in the other hand. And this is the way in which the earliest writing in the world occurred. A little piece of clay, the shape of a palm, and a reed stylus making cuneiform letters and signs and symbols, so that all of the early manuscripts of the earliest writing are palm-sized, so that in philosophy, in Plato's time, if you were able to understand the higher poetic of two or more people talking in a poetic, now you are sharing the creation of a synergy of your blossoming minds, and the language that you are speaking together is creating a new quality of relationality between all of you, and one now is able to grasp a new idea. I got it. That's the way. And the first use of that clench of grasping in philosophy were the early Pythagoreans. And their phrase was that this is the way that Pythagoras actually said it, and now we understand why. The phrase in Greek is ipsa dixit. He said it this way. It's like Jesus says something in a special way, and that if one hears it rhetorically, it goes like a pachinko game, searching for the little bits of recognition in terms of identifications, in terms of indoctrination, in terms of expectations, but with a transform from the individual idea of identity in the brain to the transparency of that. The whole mind is transparent. It's not that the identity is transparent. The entire mind is transparent. And what comes through that then is a prismatic sense of person. Now the prismatic person hears what Jesus said and hears it not only loud and clear, but hears it clearly, silently in their sharing of the expansiveness in the spectrum. The person who, founding Hermetic America as the taproot, like Pythagoras being the founding taproot of Greek philosophy, the first to call himself a lover of wisdom. It's not enough to be after knowing. It is the sharing together with wisdom as a feminine that one comes to understand that the fertility now is there together. The person who founds Hermetic America is Benjamin Franklin, because he literally set each word in a little box of metal, setting type. I'm old enough that I learned in the 7th grade how to set type. And you hold the little case in your left hand, and you have the big boxes of all of the letters and a very big box of blanks so that you can have spaces between the words. And you hand set each letter until you make the word, and then you put a blank in to separate the words. And then when you have all of this done, you proof it by putting the sheet of paper, after you have inked what you have set by hand, and you rub it with the same hand that did the stylization. You now make the imprint, and what comes out then is readable. So that there is a deep quality, a mysterious quality of the ability to transfer experience into a form that can now be printed out and can be read and expands experience by the transform of that prismatic person, bringing new dimensions into play. And the first dimension that comes into play is the dimension of consciousness. And consciousness does two things immediately at the same time. Consciousness now changes time from the frequency which limited it to forms and frees it so that now time is, as we used to say 100 years ago, time now becomes psychologically malleable. Every minute is not the same. There are some minutes that are really tense and long duration. Some minutes just fly by. So that time, as the first dimension, becomes malleable in terms of possibility, in terms of even being a time future forward. And when it's a time future forward, the time past becomes new. One of the great writers of the early 20th century, Marcel Proust, wrote a magnificent, huge novel published in about 7 volumes called À la recherche du temps perdu, The Remembrance of Things Past. And as one remembers things past in a new prismatic way, the ability then to project into possibilities without end, into futures without end, frees one from the constraints that you were born into, that you were inculcated into, and you become cosmically free. This quality of Benjamin Franklin, in doing so, in his own autobiography, lists a series of 14 qualities of character that he wanted to keep track of every hour of every day, with the expectation, and this is purely a Pythagorean early community exercise, of keeping track. He said, in order not just to improve myself, but to perfect myself. The illustration for the DVDs of Hermetic America will be myself and Benjamin Franklin, with rainbow infinity signs as our halos, and the magenta lightning of insight crackling out into the cosmos. This quality is extraordinary when one realizes that in the life of Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790, the United States was formed, but formed in such a way that there was an American way before there was a Constitution. And that the American way was a way of prismatic persons that had taken the creme de la creme of the Renaissance rediscovery of the classic way, and they began to look at Jesus in terms of the original pre-Christians, in terms of those who were followers of the way, hearers of Jesus, before all of that was stylized by a Roman church, by a Roman Empire mind. And so you began to have, like a magnet to the Western Hemisphere, all of these groups that wanted to excerpt themselves from where they had been, going towards a freedom. And the freedom, when it was originally thought of, was going forth into the wilderness. This is a little book, Forth to the Wilderness, the First American Frontier, 1754, 1774. 1754, because that is the time that Benjamin Franklin was the military head of a group meeting in upper New York State, in Albany, to try to have a mutual defense against incursions of not only Indian tribes or Indian rogues, but also those groups that sought to bring them back into an empire. The British Empire, the French Empire, the Roman Catholic Empire, the various Protestant versions of a different empire, to free themselves from this. And it was in Albany that Franklin first put out in the Albany Plan the idea of the United States. There was an ancient serpent. The serpent is the form of the energy frequency of the motion of life in terms of our scale of living creatures. And it was cut into 13 parts, each initialed by one of the colonies. And the caption was, "Divided we fall." And the first American flag was not a flag of stars and stripes. The first American flag was the serpent saying, "Don't tread on me. This energy is free. This energy belongs in a landscape so pristine that we are able to return back to our original way as beings before the stylization of so-called civilized empires, before the inculcation of limited cultural ethoses that characterize the medieval world, that we are not only free from the medievality, from the empire rationality of it, but we are free to explore qualities of our spiritual prismatic persons that have not been seen except by a few geniuses in a few communities for thousands of years. So that we are free now to do something that we just now have the capacity to do together. When Franklin was at the Constitutional Convention, Thomas Jefferson had taken over his place in Paris as the minister there. And the reports given to Thomas Jefferson about what was going on were done by James Madison. And it was because of Madison's correspondence with Jefferson and the constant ability of Benjamin Franklin to really hold an insight into the whole background of all of this, that you began to find the Bill of Rights not only amends the Constitution, but is like putting a jewel in the middle of the symbolic constitutional empire mind, that this third eye jewel is able to prismatically bring out the qualities of personal freedom as essential dimensions of consciousness that are not contained in the symbolic form. So that now you begin to have something which is characteristic of the Hermetic tradition. Learning does not belong in the schools. The schools are a part of learning, but learning is a life function. It is a continuous continuity. My whole work for 42 years was to re-emerge into something fresh called the learning civilization, which is an ancient Hermetic wisdom brought into a new time form. We not only have a new time form in one sense, all the way through the entire parfait of time forms. We're all renewed together completely about 1991. We're living in so many different new time forms that are only amenable to being masterful in terms of prismatic persons. The old rhetorical, limited, medieval, indoctrinated minds and individuals cannot function in these new time forms. They do not have any traction. They do not understand that unlimited possibilities is not a chaos. They do not understand that clinging to the old, tried, and true structures is a entombment in a medieval death. It isn't that there are aliens keeping us back. It is that there are bad habits of time forms that no longer have any viability, and those billions have not yet had a way to transform themselves and get poetic again. Get into the complementarity so that you balance the full symmetry of the polarities with transformable things, because not only does time in nature become future forward as well as creative past, but the remembering quality of the conscious dimension differentially goes into the mind and becomes the memory as a structure. And the imagination, which was the center of the integral synthesizing in the symbolic structure of the mind, exchanges so that remembering becomes the memory and the imagination becomes creative imagining. So that now one has a dimension field, a quintessential, fertile dimension field, out of which can emerge the art of the person, the prismatic person, the artist of their life. And that artists can work together and create artistic families, artistic communities, an artistic cosmos. And the creating of all of this is what the function of history as a dimension is. It is the creative prismatic spectrum of that going on. If it is not that, then it reverts and becomes just an exercise in mythic experience being conditioned by a symbolic structure to referentially link to ritual inculcations. We are either imprisoned or we are free. Let's take a break. Let's come back immediately to what we are focusing on, that there is a direct taproot of language into the shape of the mind. Our entire neural system adapts itself eventually to language, which is why in every kind of human wisdom, the emphasis is always to speak the truth. To be able to keep yourself so that one can hear what is true. To have the ability to tune yourself. And it is the tuning function of language that is the way in which the calibration and the recalibration of learning takes place. So that the Hermetic tradition is always interested in bringing us to the ability to speak and hear language in this balanced symmetry, so that the rhetorical forms that are necessary in the cycles of nature, but they need to be balanced by the poetic. The Greek term poiesis actually means creating. So it isn't just creativity. Creativity as a thing is an idea in the integral mind, and ideas are shared between the memory and the imagination. But those ideas, if left in the rhetorical cycles, eventually all by themselves abstract themselves out. They abstract themselves away from the field of nature and freeze form themselves so that there is a ritual symbol symbiosis. And what gets squeezed in between them increasingly, like a vice that is being brought together, is the latitude of experience, the freedom of the movement of feeling, the fertile liveliness of images, the ability to intergal in terms of types what the ideas will be, what the structures will be, what we will be able to remember, what we will be able to actually, in our imagination, see. Most people today are so medievally empire inculcated that they have almost no memory. And they do not have the capacity for remembering or for creative imagining. And so you find all kinds of techniques of ritual that are meant then to give you a little bit of instruction of how to improve your life, how to improve your experience by doing these 7 steps, by doing these 5 steps, by these 3 principles, by all of those kinds of diagrammatic instruction are limiting, and they are crippling. Their effect is to build up a kind of a bad cholesterol in your living system. Not just in your arteries, but in the way in which experience flows. And instead of it being a horizon, it becomes a limited mindscape. The experience of primordial Americas, of the Indians especially, was instructive. And the first person to be able to understand that the language capabilities of the American Indians were exceptional. That first person was Thomas Jefferson. And when he sent out Lewis and Clark on their monumental exploration of the unknown land, one of their instructions, primordially from TJ, was to try to bring the languages of the Indians in some way back so that they could be studied. Jefferson had compiled a number of English Indian word books, and the entire trunk when he left the White House and went to retire at Monticello was lost in fording a river in a storm. But when Lincoln was in office, because he was from the old Indian territory of Kentucky originally, and then Indiana, and finally Illinois, and was bringing America back to its primordiality, one of the things that he did was he set up an office in Washington, D.C., to receive deputations from the Indian tribes. And because the Civil War was going on, because of all of the complications of Washington, D.C., even by that time, a young man working in the department was the one who received the deputations from the American Indians. And that young man was a reporter for the Brooklyn Eagle named Walt Whitman. And Whitman had just undergone one of the deepest transforms of life that is possible. He had published in 1855 his original Leaves of Grass, 50, 60 pages of what he thought was really good poetry, and wanted to get it out there and participate in the American way of publishing your stuff, getting out in there. And he sent copies to people like Emerson, who said in writing that it seemed, pretty interesting, and maybe we're going to have an American literature after all. It so happened that two of Emerson's close confreres read Whitman's original Leaves of Grass and had a particular ability to not get into all the niceties that Emerson's great manners were, and they wanted to go and talk with Whitman, and those two were Henry David Thoreau and Amos Bronson Alcott, two of the greatest Hermetic Americans of all time. And Thoreau had to go to New York City for a medical examination, and Alcott went with him. And so the two found the hotel where the young Walt Whitman was staying, and they spent a couple of days visiting, the three of them together with Walt Whitman. And Thoreau and Alcott so got through to Whitman that the next edition of Leaves of Grass was quite a bit bigger, quite a bit more better, and then finally brought out a third edition of Leaves of Grass, which is about this size and one of the great classics of world literature. Listen to Whitman's American, Indian, informed, Thoreau, Alcott, Emerson, transcendentalist, enthused, and his own. He had a genius. In India, they call him a Mahayogi. There are many books on Whitman in India. Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself. And what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance. Retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard. Nature without check and with original energy. Nice women would not allow Whitman's Leaves of Grass into their parlors. He spoke of things like sexuality in no uncertain freedoms. One of the qualities of Bronson Alcott was that he was a quite ordinary early American until he was in his mid-30s. He became a teacher, and eventually he went to Philadelphia from Boston. He lived for a while in Germantown, then he got a teaching position in Philadelphia. And as he began to develop, as his children came, Anna, the first daughter, came, Louisa May Alcott, born in Germantown, the next to come, and there would be two more eventually. Louisa May Alcott became one of the world's great writers. Her first smash hit was Little Women, published in 1868. She was born in 1832 in Germantown. But more and more, Alcott began having the stirrings within him that there were mysteries. There were mysteriousnesses that were beginning to be noticeable. His intuitions, his insights, the spectrum of his person began to have a larger rainbow. And so he realized that the family life, as it had been inculcated and set up, was stifling him and weeding out and draining the creativity. So he hit upon a daring idea. He moved his wife and young daughters back to Germantown, and he stayed in an attic room in Philadelphia, and on weekends would walk and be back home with them. In the meantime, he was free to explore the mysteriousness as well as do his teaching work. And he began to read, and as he began to read, the capacities of insight began to open up, and he rediscovered that Plato really is doing something in the dialogues. He discovered that there are enormous qualities that have just emerged in his lifetime. He was born in 1799. He began to read Kant on the critique of pure reason and on there being a transcendental dimension to the mind that is not at all like what experience is in the practical world. This is a transcendental dimensioning of further possibilities. And just as he was making really good headway, his wife had a miscarriage with the third child and almost died. She was hemorrhaging and was just barely saved. And so Alcott realized that they would have to leave the arrangement of Philadelphia, Germantown, and move back to Boston. And so in Boston, he contacted friends and patrons and other people, and he set up a school called the School of Human Culture, but it was set up in a Masonic building on Temple Court in Boston, and so it was always referred to as the Temple School. And let me give you a few photos here just so that you get a sense of how this worked. Here's Bronson Alcott. This is a portrayal by, later on by N.C. Wyeth, the father of Andrew Wyeth. N.C. Wyeth is one of the great illustrators of children's classics. You can see in Alcott a very interesting figure. This was a later portrait of his wife, Abby. And of course, Alcott and his wife are portrayed in all of Louisa May Alcott's home epics, Little Women, Little Men, Joe's Boys, and so forth. These are the mother and the father. And this was the second of 4 daughters. This is Louisa May Alcott, who said she didn't like the photos of her. They always made her look dark and hunched and gloomy, whereas she felt bright and clear and vibrant. She was also a little taller than most girls at that time, so she had quite an interesting time. This is the house called Hillside that they lived in Concord, Massachusetts, because they eventually moved from Boston out to Concord. This is Wyeth's portrait of Bronson Alcott in his mystical, transcendental intensity. And this is this is the temple school in the Masonic Temple of Boston. Not that he was a Mason. Emerson was not a Mason, Thoreau, Whitman, but they came out of an era where there were a great many Masons. Franklin was always an honorary Mason. George Washington was a practicing Mason. Jefferson knew of it and was respectful, but not a Mason. This is Emerson at the time when he was in his late 30s, when he had left the ministry and had realized not only does learning not just belong in the schools, but that God does not just belong in the churches. That the experience of learning is a lifelong function of our prismatic persons, enjoying the visionary field that goes with the natural field and generates not only the experience, but generates history as well, so that one has a whole new quality of what will colloquially, rhetorically be called a frame of reference. Now you have a frame of reference that has nature and vision, as well as experience and history, so that if you put a diagonal, you will have something called natural history. And so natural history began to emerge as a quality of the transcendental possibilities that landscape epically gives us, and that species and kinds of things give us in the little Horace-like details of it. And increasingly now, natural history became the quality of being able to match your expansive, conscious rainbow with the details of nature and the grandeur of the whole landscape, which eventually lifted itself up and became all the stars singing together. So when Emerson wanted to have a little summer house built in his garden, Thoreau and Alcott got out their carpenter's tools and they built this little summer house in Concord, Massachusetts in the 1840s. And this was an Indonesian temple that Alcott transferred from some old architectural plans, and he and Thoreau built this in Emerson's garden in the 1840s. At the time, this is what Thoreau looked like in a sketch by one of the sons of Emerson, Edward Emerson. And you can see the mystical vibrancy of Thoreau at this early time. Because by the time he was enrolled as a freshman in Harvard, he was already a genius in languages. And one of the early works of Thoreau never published. He did his own translation of Aeschylus from the Greek, and the manuscript of that is in the Huntington Library here in San Marino, a suburb of Los Angeles. And one can inspect it if you have the academic credentials to be entrusted to look at it. The whole quality changed. The experiments that came out now were not only that there should be a school for human culture in Boston, but that there should be places like Emerson's house, but expanded so that there were new possibilities of being able to look at things. And one of the developments was called Fruitlands, built on what is today part of Harvard's campus. And this was an experimental community. And Fruitlands was a learning community for men and women together, equally, together, in an interpenetration of the genders, to open up so that the prismatic spectrums would have the full array of possibilities of insight. And as that was happening, 1843, the context generally of it was a farm called Brook Farm. And Brook Farm was in a part of what is today Boston called West Roxbury. And they went out to Brook Farm because there was a man named George Ripley, named, oddly enough, for an alchemist from the earlier centuries, and his wife Sophia. And so George and Sophia Ripley bought a farm, a plot of land, with the encouragement of Elizabeth Peabody, who was one of the great raconteurs, very wealthy in Boston, the Peabodys of Boston, the Peabody Institute, et cetera, et cetera. One of her daughters married Nathaniel Hawthorne, so that all of these people knew each other, and they all converged on Brook Farm. And this is a series of collected writings from 1840 to 1847 of all of the people who went out there to work together on this utopian commune. So that you had places like Fruitlands, you had places like Brook Farm, places like the Temple School, places like Emerson's home, and later on Hawthorne would hold forth at the Wayfarer Inn in Concord. Thoreau going out to Walden to live for 2 years to see what it was that would come out of him if he lived completely open in terms of the grandeur of nature and its details and its magnificence. And one of the most beautiful qualities is he kept a journal that runs to about 20 volumes. And one of the most poignant early experiences in Walden was the first winter, when it seemed as if the snows would never stop, and the cabin was completely buried in snow, 10, 12 feet of snow. And you couldn't get out the doors. There was no way to even look out the windows. The only thing Thoreau discovered was that one could go to the fireplace and look up the flue and see a patch of blue sky up the flue. This is a Hermetic image of the freedom that comes from giving oneself over to the refining fire, which is there in the hearth of where you live. And that this delivers a blue sky frame of reference through which you can go, and you're not only through the looking glass and in Wonderland, but you're into the reality of God's place, where there are trillions of temples of all different kinds, like sparkling sparks of confetti, and he is not contained. She is not contained in those, though is reflected in all of them. It is this quality of Hermetic America that is important to us. And when Emerson was old, he finally was taken west to see the great Sierra Nevada mountains. And the person who was going to host him at Yosemite was John Muir. And Muir was looking forward to sharing the trails with Emerson, to especially sleep out under the stars and chat with Emerson. And when he got there with his Massachusetts entourage, they said it's too damp for him to sleep out. He'll have to stay in the cabin. And Muir records in one of his diaries, the most sleepless night of my entire life. Here I am with Emerson, looking forward to an indefinite chat under the stars, and they keep him inside and I am left outside with no one to talk with. In the quality of Hermetic America is that the learning scalar is the larger context in which everything occurs. We're going to come back next week and look at this in more detail, but I want to give you a little mnemonic. I want to give you 5 sets of 3. In the Temple School in Boston, the students were arranged in triads. They would sit together in rows of 3. We have rows of 3 chairs here in honor of that technique. And the visitors would have rows of 3 chairs. So if the women came to be with their children, they would sit in 3s too. And so the whole quality of triads is extremely ancient. They're not just trinities, there are triads. There is an ancient Welsh form of the Hermetic tradition, and it is encapsulated in the Old Welsh triads. Here are 5 triads of Hermetic American educators. The first was Benjamin Franklin, the second was Thomas Jefferson, and they will be given a third at the very end. The next triad were 3 that worked together: Emerson, Thoreau, and Alcott, like the transcendentalist community, not the Trilateral Commission. The next 3, William James, Henry Adams, and John Dewey. They form a psychological, philosophical, historical triad of making an education that now is not limited to the schools, but is a part of life. One of Henry Adams' greatest books was The Education of Henry Adams. How he got to be who he really was and was able to see in a completely new way. So William James, Henry Adams, and John Dewey, the psychological, philosophical. The fifth triad, Robert M. Hutchins, Robert Oppenheimer, and James Harvey Robinson. We don't know Robinson so much anymore. We've talked about him, The Mind in the Making. He was an exquisite educator. You can buy The Mind in the Making free on the web. These are books that, and I'll leave out the information so you can see. And you can just get your own copy. One of the best sellers of the 1920s. He's the one in New York City, in Columbia University, that set up one of the most powerful Renaissance groups in Hermetic America, the New School for Social Research, which brought together the crème de la crème of American and European and other thinkers to be educated there. From China came Hu Shi, who later was instrumental in having John Dewey go to China and teach for a year in China. The New School for Social Research is one of the most powerful and poignant places. Robert Oppenheimer, of course, we know with his Manhattan Project work, but he was also, after the Manhattan Project, he became the head of the Institute for Advanced Research at Princeton, which till today is one of the most sophisticated collections of geniuses on the planet. They do not need to teach. They do not need to write. All they need to do is, when they want to get together and chat or to walk alone. And one of the early, most distinguished members of that was Albert Einstein. And so Oppenheimer was the head of that. The Franklin and Jefferson, I'm putting my own work in with theirs so that we form a triad. In the sense, Franklin reestablishes the field by personally living in such a way that the entire understanding of the Hermetic tradition resurfaced in his person and in the prism of his activities and accomplishments, which dovetailed into Jefferson. And the two most beautiful exemplars of the writings of Jefferson that brought this in, not just the influence on the Bill of Rights, but of course the Declaration of Independence, and the Notes on the State of Virginia, which is the first time that someone canvassed the entire natural history of an area. That the state of Virginia was looked at by Jefferson in every single kind of aspect and wrote it out as like a complete portrait of Virginia, so that the reader could, in his reading way, join the experience of Virginia. And one of the taproots of this was Jefferson's father, who was one of the earliest surveyors of Virginia and used to take young Thomas with him on the pioneering surveying of places in Virginia, especially the Blue Ridge Mountains, so that Jefferson's lands with the natural arch out in the Blue Ridge, his father and himself as a boy had done the original surveying. So the Notes on the State of Virginia is a natural history of the entire landscape. And it was because of this quality he was able to understand, when he became president, to acquire the Louisiana Purchase and then to send out the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore it, which later on in Lincoln's time was being developed as the exploration of the unexplored part of the Louisiana Purchase territories, the American Southwest. Unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated before he could commence it, but it was finally undertaken in 1869 by Powell, John Wesley Powell. He explored the Green and the Colorado rivers that run from Wyoming down through Utah, down into Arizona, and coming all the way to the border with California, the Grand Canyon especially. And the illustrations of his book, which is available, The Exploration of the Colorado River and its Canyons, has been reprinted. And when Powell got together, finally, with writing up his book on the explorations, he was appointed as the head of the Bureau of American Indian Ethnology. And every year, the United States, the Hermetic American, United States, published big old green volumes like this. And this is the first annual report of the Bureau of American Ethnology. Finally, you had a one-armed survivor of the Civil War, courageous enough to take the chair that just a few years before had been in the young hands of Walt Whitman and began to develop in his own way, because Captain Powell was a very courageous man, a real John Wayne figure, a tough guy. He writes, "The exploration of the Colorado River of the West began in 1869 by the authority of congressional action, was by the same authority subsequently continued as the second division of the Geographical and Geologic Survey of the Territories, so that from Jefferson as a boy surveying Virginia, now within 100 years you had the surveying of the whole vast continent beyond the Mississippi, carrying the vision of Hermetic America all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And eventually, one would look over half the planet of the Pacific, not just to Asia, but look in such a way that the eyes would go up. And part of the quality of California and its coast, San Francisco and Los Angeles especially share it, is that it is easy for here to look up, to look out into the stars, to look out into the cosmos and consider it completely a natural history of ours to send exploring expeditions out, like Apollo, like Voyager, like Galileo to Jupiter, like Cassini to Saturn, like New Horizons out to Pluto, like Dawn out to the asteroid belt to look at Ceres and all the rest, to send Messenger to Mercury, to send dozens to Mars, to go back to the moon, to not just send machines, but to inhabit the entire star system in a way that we expand the visionary prisms, which we are. More next week.